Welcome to Focus on Albany. I'm Cynthia Pooler. My guest today is Mike Connors, and we're going to have a discussion about Matthew Clyne and why he switched from the Democratic Party to the Conservative Party. So, Mike, when you read about it in the paper, were you surprised?
I say that again.
When you read about it in the newspaper, were you surprised?
A little, not as much
Okay,
as I probably should have been. You know, I have to be very forthright with you. I don't have any insights about why Matt switched himself personally. I can give you my opinion why I think
that's
Matt and a
fine.
lot of Democrats are unhappy with the direction of the party. But I think Matt would be a great one for you to interview about that specifically. I think his teaming up with Tom Spargo will make the Conservative Party a formidable force in marginal districts. I know Spargo well, and I've known Spargo for a long time and think highly of Tom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the two of them will be a very effective team. As you may remember, Matt ran as a candidate several times in Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a Republican stronghold, and Matt couldn't get candidates to run, and I think he succeeded Kenny Thatcher. So when he was chairman of the Bethlehem Democrats, he actually had to run for office himself a few times. And Matt was the leader of the crowd that eventually led to the Democratic takeover of elected offices in Bethlehem. Matt had some difficulties with some of the factions or wings, and that quote about the Democratic Party that Will Rogers gave back during the Depression was a great quote, and it was prescient. And somebody said to him, "Well, gee, are you a member of an organized party?" And Will Rogers, who was a number one entertainer at the time, said, "No, I don't belong to an organized party. I'm a Democrat."
Mm-hmm.
And he was referring to all of the schisms and fractures and fighting that went on within the party. So I think that was pretty much true right up until a couple of years ago. Now the prevailing orthodoxy is that if you don't adhere to the party line, you're not a good Democrat, and they put the squeeze on people pretty good. But it'll be interesting as we talk about this as to what actually you think is to why Matt left. I'm as anxious to hear what you think about it as I am to blather on about what I think.
Well, I know that the Conservative and Democratic Party has had a long history of, uh, in Albany, of aligning themselves with each other. So, from your perspective, can you give me a little background on the Conservative and Democratic Party and how they formed a coalition?
I'm trying to. I'm having difficulty hearing you.
Really?
Can you ask that question
Okay.
again?
There, all, there's been a long history in the city of Albany, or maybe the county, of an alliance between the Conservative Party and the Democratic Party.
Yeah, yeah.
Can
That
you?
probably goes back to the 30s and definitely the 40s. I know when I ran for county legislature in a primary against an incumbent Democrat, I also ran in a primary as a conservative for the conservative line. And I think that was 1991. And it was the largest new class to come into the legislature, I think, in history. There were 17 new county legislators that got elected, and most of them won primaries. There were 11 primaries in the city of Albany at that time. I think there were 15 county legislative seats, and there was 11 primaries, and the leadership got overturned. In the marginal seats in the suburbs, Bethlehem, Gilliland, Colony, and the hill towns, if you didn't have the conservative line as a second line, you were not going to win the general election. And there were a number of elections through the 80s, 90s, the 2000s, and even right up into the most recent one in 2019. There were Democratic candidates who would not have been elected without the votes they got on the conservative line. And I think historically, if you look at it, it's probably the upstate Albany Democrats were more conservative than their brethren in New York City, for sure.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's my understanding of the history behind it.
Mhm.
Uh, just like the Republican Party in Rensselaer County controls the relationship with conservatives, they've used the conservative line in Rensselaer County as Democrats do in Albany County. The Democrats have a new alliance in the last maybe 15 or 20 years. I think Harold Joyce started working with the Working Families Party back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Mhm.
And that's become the go-to second line for Democrats. And even right now, today, our governor, who's in real trouble electorally and feels that Democrats are, has advocated, along with Jay Jacobs, the state Democratic chairman, the creation of a third party for another line. And again, for some of your listeners, fusion voting, where you add the total vote from one line to another for a total vote. New York State is very unusual to have that fusion voting. That is something that Governor Cuomo and Jacobs tried to do away with about 3 years ago, and they were unsuccessful in accomplishing that. And now it's ironic that Jacobs is pushing that Democratic candidates should have this third party line that they're organizing now. So there's
Mhm.
been a long history of that in New York. And, elections are highly fought and very deeply and bitterly felt. People talk about it, particularly at local elections. I had a constituent say to me once, he said, the smaller the pie, the more vicious the fight. And they were talking about a small village race at that time. And, it was a pretty interesting line, but that has led to this need for Democratic candidates to have an additional line to be successful in primarily suburbs. And maybe a couple of the wards in Albany, it might have been a problem at one point in time, but with redistricting, that's not an issue anymore.
So, when was the idea of getting another line, in other words, from a conservative line to the working families line? When did that switch?
I
Was it
think
gradual?
I would think when Harold Joyce was chairman of the party, Harold is also a very powerful union leader,
Okay.
and I think it was the CWA and Communications Workers of America and some other groups were unhappy with some things that were going on, and they were looking for more electoral success and more power. So, uh, the Working Families Party was really not a significant factor in Albany County, I don't think, until after the year 2000. So it was probably 95, 96, 97, somewhere about, but you'd have to check the records to be sure. But the person who really started pushing that locally was Harold Joyce, who was chairman of the party and also chairman of the county legislature at that time.
Hmm.
So when he started pushing this as a line or another venue for Democratic candidates to get additional votes, where you would add these votes together, that was the advent of the changeover. When the Conservative Party has been, I think, even in the last election, was very important to a number of elections, local elections, for people, county legislators and town council members would not have been elected without that line. So I think in the old days, I say old days, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, if
Hmm.
you were going to run on the conservative line, you could not accept the Working Families Party endorsement. At
Hmm.
that time, if you were going to take the Working Family Party endorsement, you could not accept that if you were going to accept the conservative line. That's weakened quite a bit, I think, in the last 5 or 6 years. But that was pretty much the background that I can remember on that.
So today, when people go for the conservative line, it's usually their main line is the Republicans, right?
Who's main line?
The Republican candidates usually go for the conservative line, right?
Yeah, I think in other states that's correct, and probably it's probably true downstate. Albany County is a little different than the rest of the state. I mean, we've been very successful financially comparison to upstate New York, partially because of having the state university system here, the hospital and health systems here, the state legislature and the capital, and all of the jobs that brings. Has made this a much different county than the upstate. It's a county that remained blue when the rest of the upstate turned red in the presidential elections, and also for some of the statewide elections.
Hmm.
So Albany County, I think in general, is a more conservative county for Democrats than it is in many other places. Although with the
So,
advent of more and more people from the state legislature getting elected to the county legislature, to the school boards, to town boards, to members of the common council, I think the push from New York City has been very strong to push a more leftist agenda.
okay, so you say it's the agenda. The agenda is the cause of people getting the working family line rather than the conservative line, right?
I think it was not only that, but it was the money that was available. I think Working Families Party had quite a bit of money. They had a lot of backing at one time from the unions, and I'm not sure if that was a funnel for the Soros money or not. But the I think the most recent trend that the Democrats are losing favor with the voting public have come from some fairly significant leftist viewpoints that don't really settle that well on the palate of many upstaters.
So back in the Corning days, when you were young, um, did Corning run on the conservative line also?
Yes.
He did.
Hmm.
Okay, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
And he may have also had the liberal line too at one point in time. I know when he ran for lieutenant governor, he had strong statewide support, but I don't think that the third party lines really got to be a big issue until the 50s or 60s
okay,
around in New York anyways. That whole idea of fusion voting really came into vogue then, and
okay.
has been practiced more. Now with the heavy downstate electoral support, in the legislature, you can get 76 votes for the Speaker of the Assembly within the city, within three boroughs of the city of New
Hmm.
York. You can
Hmm.
just about put the 76 together. So, even though Staten Island is a very conservative borough, the other four boroughs are extremely heavy blue counties. So, the number of members of assembly necessary to be speaker came from the city of New York. The same is true now with the Senate Majority Leader.
So I vaguely remember reading about you running on the Republican ticket. Um, I find that I find that a little amusing, actually.
Well, it was amazing. It's a long story and a good one for a separate interview because you can't answer it quickly. But I was asked to run for the assembly by some people, and
Mhm.
I was betrayed by some other folks, and it became quite apparent that I was not going to get the independent party line or the conservative line as a second line to run. And I don't believe that I would have beaten Bob Prentice without a second line. The person that should have run, I pushed it pretty hard to get the person to run that I thought could beat Assemblyman Prentice at that time, who was considered unbeatable. When normally you run and you collect petitions, the party chooses who's on your committee and vacancies.
Mhm.
And this is important because this will tell you how we get something done differently. when we did my petitions back then in 2004 for the assembly race, I controlled the committee on vacancies. I had people that worked on my campaign, people that were friends of mine, people from North Albany, people that I trusted. So when it became apparent that I was betrayed and not going to be able to successfully complete the assembly race, I went right to the top. I talked to the candidate's wife to ask, I wanted to make sure that when I was pitching this, that it would be well received at home. So and the wife jokingly said, it'd be great to get him out of the house. Why don't you do that? So I spoke to the person who should have been the candidate, and Bob Riley accepted that. So my committee on vacancies actually appointed Bob as the candidate because of the timing to run for the New York State Assembly seat. And he was successful, as I suggested earlier would be the case, and beat a long-term incumbent assemblyman in a split district. I then was asked on a radio show if I would run for the Senate, and I jokingly asked the person that called me to call me back when he was sober, and it resulted in a run for the Senate. And Senator Bruno was very gracious and very kind, and so I did run for the Senate on the Republican line in 2004. And well, I only had one line. I got crushed, as I knew I would be, but I did lead the ticket for Republicans in that county. I actually got more Republican votes than George Bush did. Also, if you were to look at the numbers, it turned out that I had more Democrats crossing over to vote for me. The Democrats could vote for someone who switched parties far more easily than the Republicans would. The Republicans didn't trust the Democrat running as a Republican, so I had very little Republican support. Now, at that same time, we had been successful in getting Republican town chairman in Gilliland and a deputy chair in Colony to run as Democrats, to flip parties, and they were elected as Democrats easily. So Ken Runyon and Ken Runyon was the supervisor then in Gilliland, was elected as supervisor as a Democrat. I think we did the same thing in Bethlehem. And then, of course, we did with Sheila Mahan in the town of Colony. So it was not uncommon for people to jump parties. So it was pretty interesting that people who were furious that I ran on a Republican line liked pretty much what the agenda was that I pitched. I talked about Medicaid reform, which is something still needs great reform in New York State, and improving the services that people are getting out of Medicaid. I talked about parity for health insurance for the mentally ill, which is still a very big issue, and talked about more support at the local level for local governments to pick up more of the services delivery. They do a better job of delivering those services than the state does. So those issues were very near and dear to me, and they gave me a chance to talk about those issues. And I got trounced as was expected, and but I did lead the Republican ticket and outpolled the president. So I thought that was pretty funny at the time.
You just said
something. I didn't think this was important. I didn't think this was important to people because I thought the issues counted. But when I went back to the Democratic line, I had people who did not like me, and I didn't think ever voted for me, come up to me on the street and say, "Oh, yeah, this is great. We're so glad you came back." And it was pretty moving as to how deeply some people felt about the party loyalty line. And it's interesting that I had people who I were not friendly, very supportive. I had some people from the Board of Elections at that time say that Mike Connors should not ever be supported as a Democrat, and of course I was primaried after that for the Comptroller's office twice, and they were unsuccessful in both primaries, both later primaries and the earlier primary. It didn't really hurt me in any way at all, but it did upset some people. I felt very badly about the people whose feelings I hurt by doing that.
So tell me, You were raised in a political household, and you've been involved in politics all your life. So when a Democrat runs in the city of Albany, that's the end all be all, right?
Oh,
It,
not only
it,
in the city, in the county. The joking refrain starting in New York City back in the 70s was NDC. It was the New Democratic Coalition.
mhm.
And Ken Thatcher, who I served in the presidential nominating convention with, Ken was the chairman of the town of Bethlehem, and Ken nicknamed the New Democratic Coalition, which was Bob Abrams and Elliot Engel and Bella Abzug and a number of other people. What he said is November doesn't count. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you have to win the primary and that's it. So in the city of Albany, it's been that way for quite some time.
Mhm.
There really is no significant um, Republican Party in Albany County, and hasn't been for some time. Although in 1991, there were 17 county legislators that were Republican. By 2003 or 2000, but maybe by 1999 even, they were down to 8 or 9 or 7 or 8 or county legislators who were Republicans. So it's strictly about winning the Democratic primary in the city of Albany and in most of Albany County.
So would you say that because the city of Albany is predominantly Democrat and the suburbs are more or less maybe leaning Republican?
Well, they used to be, but the
Would you?
enrollments, which was people moved out of the city and became more
Okay.
prosperous and moved to the suburbs. I think the all three towns have either parity on enrollment or actually superiority. I think Bethlehem and Gillen have more enrolled Democrats than they have Republicans.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's the same in the town of Colony. The upset win in Colony
Crummy?
for supervisor this past
Right.
year, Peter Crummy was a well-known judge and had done a very good job on the bench and had run unopposed for a number of times. Old family, very active in the town of Colony, well-known, and he ran for an open seat. The incumbent did not run, so with an open seat, he had the chance to win, and he won convincingly in the town of Colony. So whether that portends a dramatic shift back to Republicans, I don't know.
Mhm.
But I would imagine that this will be a very interesting next 2 years for elections. This year, not so much locally. I don't see any of the members of Assembly or Senate having any problems. They're going to be reelected
Mhm.
without any difficulty. Same thing with the member of Congress. I think where you'll see some interesting races will be next year at the county legislative race.
So, back in 2004, you said you ran for the assembly, right?
Well, actually, I circulated petitions to run for the assembly, but
Okay.
because I attacked the state legislature's handling of Medicaid and their mishandling of government in general, I was not terribly viewed favorably by Speaker Silver. And so the people that ran the Democratic apparatus for the speaker made it very clear they were not going to support my efforts. And
So,
it was pretty clear I was not going to get any kind of
so,
Democratic
so
support.
I assume that you lived in Colony at the time.
I did, yes, I did. I lived in
Okay.
Manans at that time. That's
Uh,
correct.
okay. And the reason I asked you that is I remember crystal clear the election of 2000. And I had lived in Saratoga County at that time. And I worked on Dan Lynch's campaign. And Dan and Joe Sullivan had talked to Dan and said, what there might be a possibility of you losing, and he, this kind of you know, didn't think that was going to happen. Well, it did happen, and Dan Lynch became very, very bitter. He was bitter because he felt it crazy that he should lose to somebody with less intellect than what he had.
Well, I helped Dan a little bit on that, and I just happened to look at his book about 2 weeks ago. Somebody referred me to his book, and I looked at it, and it was called Running with the Machine.
Yep.
And he had a story in there about me raking the leaves in front of the house, and the Nan's and stopped by, and apparently I gave him a couple of beers. He remembered that, wrote that in the
Hmm.
book. But I did warn him that he's going to have a real problem being supported, because a lot of people were mad at him for things he had written as an editor and later on as a columnist. Dan had a tremendous sense of humor and great wit, and he could skewer you quite. Uh, it would be quite hurtful to the sensitive psyche of an elected official or appointed officials
Hmm.
in government. And so a lot of people who are mad at Dan, you know, screwed him during that assembly race. And he should have won that assembly race. He had, an even enrollment, and he gets screwed. It was
Well,
unfortunate. And I think Dan would have been tremendous in the assembly, because he wouldn't have put up with all this downstate driving the agenda, and he wouldn't have
mhm,
been bullied around. He was
mhm,
his own person. And you're right. I think it did embitter him.
mhm.
It's funny how losses will affect you. Some people, it does embitter, and others, it's a learning lesson, and you pick up and you move on and you progress. But Dan was really unhappy with the way the results of that
Mhm.
election went, and I
So,
can fully understand that, because I've been on the other side where I've been stabbed in the back. The joke I always said is I only need to buy half of a bulletproof vest.
mhm.
And someone said, "Why only half, Mike?" I said, "I only need the back half with my friends. They're
Wow.
only going to shoot you in the back or stab you in the back."
Right.
And of course,
Well,
he had a big laugh. And,
on that note, we're
I
out
was
of
being very honest about it.
we're out of time. So I look forward to talking with you in the future about other issues pertaining to Albany, maybe the Democratic Party, or maybe something will come up that we don't know about, we can't foresee. But I look forward to talking with you again. You've been listening to Mike Connors, who's the retired county controller. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Focus on Albany. And if you like this show, subscribe to my YouTube page. Thanks, Mike. Have a great day, and thank you, everybody,
Thank
for
you,
listening.
Thank you, Cynthia. Take care.